community that was very strong in Cleveland, a black nationalist community. And you had the Deacons for the Defense, who provided security for civil rights leaders that were being killed and assassinated, and all kind of things were going on. So what does this contextually have to do with 1988? A whole lot. A lot of people also went underground in the 60s and 70s because of the counterintelligence initiative by the FBI. The FBI involved in counterintelligence is a war terminology. That's not like just watching somebody or spying on somebody or tapping a phone. When you say COINTELPRO, that's counterintelligence, that's war. That means there's going to be some physical outcomes that came about as a result of surveillance, of tap phones and things of that nature. And many of you already know what happened. You know, Martin Luther King was a product. He was a tragedy. He was a victim of COINTELPRO. We know now that the FBI was tapping his phone, that the United States Army followed them everywhere they went. There was a fictitious letter that was given to a newspaper in Memphis deriding Martin Luther King for staying in a suburban hotel, and that facilitated his movement into the hotel in Memphis, which where the military, paramilitary men were set up, then assassinated him. That's all COINTELPRO. In Chicago, the major gang leaders had gotten together to forge a truce amongst themselves. We find out later on that one of the most important young leaders, a brother by the name of Fred Hampton, a 21-year-old leader of the Black Panther Party who had been a 20-year-old leader of the youth NAACP chapter in Chicago, sat down with gang leaders in Chicago. And in the midst of the negotiation, the FBI counterintelligence program began what is called a poison pen program, writing letters back and forth to the leaders that were in prison, attacking the leaders' integrity and saying this is going on, that going on, and help to actually kind of, divide the young people. So much so that they couldn't move forward at the rate that they wanted to move forward to stop gang violence. That was 1968. Now Chicago is one of the most violent cities in America. Probably that's part of what we call it, when something's still around from historic terms, what do you call it, Doc? It's
residual effect.
Residual effect. So Fred Hampton was assassinated by a police intelligence unit in his own home, in his own bed. If you've seen the story, if you Googled it up, you saw how many shots went in, no shots went out. His wife was pregnant with then Fred Jr., who is now a major activist in Chicago. But that was COINTELPRO. So COINTELPRO had a major effect on a lot of things that were going on in our country. And one of the biggest impacts it had was people went underground. Doc, I know when you speak, you'll be talking about that. But what was the impact of all these people going underground? It began to slow down a lot of the movement. Martin Luther King's, assassination, Robert Kennedy's assassination, many other things that went on in 1968. And those of us who are in our 60s now can really appreciate that even more because we lived through those eras, and so consequently, they began to reemerge in the 80s. That's what I'm saying. A lot of people got out of prison. A lot of the Panthers reemerged. A lot of the convictions were overturned in Chicago of gang leaders and things of that nature.
A lot of people underground went to Africa.
A lot of people went to Africa, you're right. So all this was going on in urban America in the generation that we're talking about now. And in addition, there was what we call a movement of cultural development in the urban areas. The Black Arts movement coming out of San Francisco wasn't just artwork. Obviously, artwork was important, but it was a new way of looking at music, African dance, the whole aspect of culture. That emerged out of New York, out of Harlem as well. It began to become fashionable on the campuses to dress up in African garb, to wear, little things like this or whatever, that's part of the liberation. That's part of the cultural liberation. The language began to change a lot. The way people looked at themselves and how they greeted each other. It wasn't, hey, my nigga, it was, how you doing? Assalamu alaikum, Habar Ghani. So that fed that whole aspect of resistance to what had been going on in the United States. And that became very popular. And then also a whole array of authors emerged. who had begun to research the classical African history. Meaning that our history as Africans in America did not begin in slavery. That it began in Africa, and Africa wasn't a backwards continent with people with bones in the nose and running around naked, talking about Kemo Sabe and Tarzan. Can you save me? That was not, that was not Africa's history. That Africa's history went back, and in fact, people like our brother Sheikh Anta Diop came with the whole concept of construct that there is no Middle East, that Egypt is actually in Africa. And there is no Middle East, and if it was, as we say in the hood, show us the Middle West. So we began to center ourselves into classical African civilizations where things took place that preceded any other, what we call civilized society, before the platelets broke or whatever, you know what I mean? That were there Greeks or Romans or scholars that had gotten their education in what we call Kemet, that Herodotus, that Plato, that Aristotle, all of these scholars and what we call the fathers of European Renaissance or European whatever, you understand, had studied in Africa, had been involved with the systems of the Masonic or what they call the sacred systems of Africa. That Imhotep was the father of medicine and not Hippocrates. You understand? So all these kind of things will begin to be printed up, and that some of it was just Xerox, you know. And John Henry Clark came out with his paperwork. Brothers like sisters like Gisela Houston wrote a book on the Ethiopians that talked about the history of Ethiopia as being the birthplace of Christianity in many ways, and also that Menelik, who was the son of Solomon, there was a whole history in what they call Abyssinia or Ethiopia, and that had been overlooked by obviously our Western historians and things of that nature. So this whole construct of information beginning to come out on the college campuses stimulated this movement, which is called the Afrocentric or cultural specific or African-centered movement. And everybody was affected by it, even those that didn't think that they were. You know, and we came in our 30s during that time. But the other thing that came along with the Afrocentric movement and the hip-hop and all that was crack cocaine. You know, and I can stand here and say unequivocally that was no accident. Right. Because drugs have always been used as a social control mechanism in the world. It didn't start with the United States. It was used in China, it's been used in other parts of the world. But for some reason, you know, there was this, you know, myth put out there that heroin was not biological warfare. But we knew heroin was biological warfare, chemical warfare, because at the height of all of the activity in the 60s, in particular in Cleveland, crack was not around at that time, heroin was around. And after the Glenville riot, after the Huff riots, after all these riots where young people began to stand up, we call them rebellion. Heroin came out of nowhere. People that I grew up with that were my, you know, peers that didn't maybe mess around with a little marijuana or something like that or whatever, you know, so a little marijuana, this and that, they started to have packets of heroin. And heroin began to become the drug of choice in neighborhoods where you never saw heroin before. So now we're talking about, again, deconstruction of movements to reconstruct our community by introducing this poison into our community. That was very, very important because it slowed down a lot of the progress.